Okay, while we're getting folks in from the waiting room, I thought I'd remind everybody, if you want participation points or a certificate of completion for today, just send me an email to verify your participation and I'll get that taken care of. Didn't set up today's meeting with everyone on mute, so just wanted to warn everybody when you log in, you might need to mute yourselves. But we do have 9 o'clock on both of the clocks now, so I think I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for session 12. So this morning's agenda, we'll do our mindfulness moment, and then I'll introduce the guest presenters like always. Our first guest presenter is Scott Eyre, and he will be presenting on the trauma stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. After we hear from Scott, we'll hear from Dustin, Jansen, and Dr. Harold Foster, and we'll be sharing information on American Indian students and resources for them. Okay, getting some folks in here from the waiting room. Okay, so this morning's mindfulness moment is probably one of my favorites so far. Those who know me know I'm a gardener. So today I found us an article which is 7 ways gardening is an exercise in mindfulness, and I can tell you this works for me. Okay, so this article was written by Martha Brettschneider and published in Women's Health in May of 2020. Martha says, whether or not we have a garden of our own, something in our DNA draws us to flowers. The connection goes beyond appreciating the surface beauty of the blossom. The very act of connecting with flowers and other plants instills a sense of calm and inner peace that boosts our overall happiness levels. Science backs up the Chinese proverb that tells us, if you want a happy lifetime, be a gardener. Research shows that people who spend time cultivating plants experience less stress, have a more positive outlook on life, and are healthier, both physically and mentally. I guess happy works there also. She goes on to say that she led a highly nomadic life for the first 30 years and was a late bloomer as far as gardening, but she has found gardening to be her mindfulness mentor long before she had ever heard those terms. And I can echo those statements. When I was reading this article, I started to feel like I had written it myself. Anyway, so the first way that Martha shares with us is gardening grounds us in the present moment. It's the sensory experience of gardening. So it's digging in the dirt, smelling the flowers, feeling the breeze on your face. And this keeps the gardener present in the moment. She says, worries about the future or past dissolve the instant we're digging in the dirt. And I don't know about the instant, but definitely does help. I also support ripping the heads off weeds to de-stress as well. All right, let me get a few folks in here. Okay, so the second way Martha talks about gardening as mindfulness is she says, gardening connects us to the source of creation. By cultivating new growth and beauty in the environment and helping deliver Earth's gifts, we are acting in alignment with the picture plan of the universe, and the Earth rewards us for paying attention to its needs. As Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, Earth laughs in flowers. The third way she shared with us is gardening and maintaining a compost pile in particular teaches us that beauty will eventually arise from the muck. This is a good lesson to hold to your heart in the midst of dark times. You might be bogged down in a life situation that feels like a slimy mix of coffee grounds, vegetable peels, and rotting leaves. But with patience, self-reflection, and time, positive transformation occurs. The fourth way Martha shared with us is gardening teaches us how to weed out non-beneficial plants and make room for new growth of our choosing. In much the same way that mindfulness teaches us to weed out non-beneficial thoughts that don't serve us, each practice supports the other, resulting in the flourishing of our internal and external gardens. The fifth way is gardening nurtures us. Oh, and I just realized I didn't move the slide, so let's do that. Okay. Nurtures us is creativity. Color, texture, and form are the paintbrushes in landscape design. And gardening benefits us beyond flowers by engaging our senses and pulls us into creative spaces of our right brain. The sixth way is gardening teaches us to let go of our need for control. When you're a gardener, you will learn that things die. Gardeners learn to accept the impermanence with the knowledge that spring will return without fail each year. The seventh way Martha shared with us is that gardening teaches us that even on the rainy days, focusing on details unveils sparkling and unexpected beauty. And as the saying goes, without rain, growth is impossible. No matter how many teachers I follow, no matter how many books I read, the garden has always offered up life's most important lessons in happiness. It has taught me patience, the need to let go of control, and the need to let go of expectations. The garden is a place for transformation. Most importantly, the garden has taught Martha, a quiet mind is calm, content, and aware. The link is in the PowerPoint, so you're welcome to read the article in full. I just tried to do a quick overview for us. Our first guest presenter this morning will be Scott Eyre, and Scott works for the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health as a school-based mental health specialist. And Scott also acts as the liaison for the State Board of Education, working on the Safe and Healthy Schools team. He is also a part of the School Safety Center leadership team, which he works to identify evidence-based approaches that increase the physical and psychological safety of students and improve overall school climate. Scott has a passion for working with youth and spent the first decade of his career at Provo Canyon School, where he helped to develop the early adolescent and elementary programs there. In 2016, he began his employment with the state, where he spent 3 years with Juvenile Justice Services before transferring into his current position. Scott holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from UVU, and is currently in pursuit of completing his master's degree in social work at University of Utah. In his free time, Scott enjoys being outdoors, coaching his son's sports teams, building and testing paddle boards, and running/surviving the occasional ultra marathon in the desert. Thank you for joining us this morning, Scott. After Scott, we'll be hearing from Dustin Jansen, and he is the director of Utah's Indian Affairs. Dustin is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. He's been practicing Indian law and policy since 2006. Dustin currently serves as the director, like I mentioned, of the Division of Indian Affairs and works as an assistant professor of American Indian Studies at Utah Valley University. Dustin has been married to his wife, Choma, I hope I've said that right, Choma Jansen, for 20 years. And Choma is enrolled with the Sioux Asboni tribe of Fort Peck, Montana, and they have 4 children. Dustin, please forgive me if I did not say that right this morning, and correct me when you get on to share with us. With Dustin will be Dr. Harold Foster, who has been a longtime coworker of mine, and I'm excited to hear from him this morning. Chuck was born and raised on the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona. He has 44 years of education experience, both as a teacher and a school administrator. He is also a former collegiate athlete and a former high school cross country and track and field coach. He received his undergraduate degree from University of Arizona and doctorate degree from Brigham Young University. His doctoral dissertation entitled "The Learning Style Differences of Navajo and Caucasian Students on and near the Navajo Nation in Northern Arizona and New Mexico," is used as a foundational study among many American Indian educators. Most of his professional work is associated with education to infuse Native language and culture into the context of teaching and learning and the development of American Indian curriculum. He presently serves as the American Indian Education Specialist Title VI program at the Utah State Board of Education. He has 4 adult children and 4 grandchildren, and his wife, Maria, of 45 years, reside in Orem. Chuck's father is also a Navajo code talker, where most of his inspiration and desire originated to become an educator. Look forward to hearing from Chuck, like I mentioned. Okay, we won't give you that just yet. Now I will stop sharing and put my brain over here to the participant. And I do see Scott has joined us. I just kept clicking the admit all button, so I wasn't sure who was here with us.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
So nice to see you. So I'm happy to turn the screen over to you. Does that work? We forgot to chat about this.
Yeah, that's kind of how I think this will roll. So if that works for you.
It does. I will be here on mute and I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Great. Let's see if I can get my screen working. And how's my audio? Is that good?
It's good for me. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. See that there are some participants. It's always nice to see people's faces. Are you guys able to see my screen, or are we there yet? Okay. Good. In this virtual world, you never know how presentations will go. I'm not going to lie. I was doing a presentation for some folks the other day, and I was doing a great job, and found out that my internet cut out about 10 minutes in, and everybody was left anxiously awaiting my return. So if something comes up, just know that we'll work through it. But I am really excited to be here. I think this is a great opportunity for professional development and for me to learn from others. I'm really excited to present with the other folks that are here today. Just really quickly, if I can maybe get an idea of the folks in the room, can I hear from you on your roles with youth? Maybe get somebody to open their mic and give me just a quick background on what you all are doing in your work with youth, and also maybe talk to me a little bit, if you don't mind, about the book that I was introduced to when I asked to present on trauma stewardship. Is there someone that would like to open their mic and share with me?
I guess I will. Nobody else is taking it up. Kelly will. So
Thanks,
I'm
Kelly.
a mentor or Check and Connect mentor at Tulare County School District. I'm working with all the DCFS, JJS kids, and also systems of care. I see a lot of kids come in with trauma or being displaced from homes, of course. I track their attendance, grades, behaviors. We talk about what they're doing in school, how I can help them if I need. And I just actually got one of my kids some therapy, so we're doing good. That's kind of what I do.
Awesome. So you guys are right in the thick of it. You guys are working hands-on with the youth. Have you guys, I won't ask, maybe raise a hand, but maybe a head nod. Are you familiar with the book? Have you read the book, Trauma Stewardship? I know this was something that, to me, I'm always looking for the next place to increase my own knowledge. And this presentation, this book was thrown out there as one that some of the folks in the field were reading. And I actually really enjoyed this book. So I'll refer to it a little bit, but this is not meant to be a book report by any means. And I'll to put you on the spot to whether or not you read it or not. So don't feel that way. But I did want to take some of those concepts in the book, some of the things that I found really valuable, and do a personal and professional reflection, which is my goal for today's meeting. Now, before I really get started, I want to just kind of start with this idea of an ikigai. An ikigai is a Japanese word that refers to purpose. It refers to why we're here, why we do the work we do. Now, everybody has their own reason of entering this work. And I want you to just maybe ask yourself why you're here, why you're doing this work. This is tough work. Anybody who's been around long enough to know that that we have oftentimes some very difficult cases that we work with, very difficult content situations. And I'd venture to guess that many folks that come into this work feel that they have talents that they're effective with the youth. Maybe you find out that you connect with these youth stories, and that it's important for you to engage with them and work through them with them and their situations in a way that maybe connects to your own lived experience. Um, I also think some of us just can't turn away from the fact that there is a need. And so this ikigai model, let me share with you, is this concept of doing what we love, doing what we're good at, doing what the world needs, and also what we can make a living on, and applying that to our work. It's something that I use with it's something that I use with the youth in the past to help guide them towards their purpose and their meaning. And I'm guessing that that's what brings us here today. And I think that's an important place to start, because this is tough work and it's going to be hard. A lot of what we talk about today is going to be around self-care and the importance of that. I really appreciate what Amanda was sharing, and how we start these meetings with the idea of mindfulness and meditation even, and coming to a place of wellness personally, because we can't do this work effectively without putting ourselves first. And sometimes that's hard to hear. Sometimes it even feels selfish. But I will as I go through the presentation, just really hit that home with you guys. I think that it's so important that we're willing to put ourselves first, and that we're willing to do that in a way that benefits the lives of others. So I'm going to ask you to do three things today, if you could, for me. One, whenever I run a group or a presentation, I'm going to ask you and invite you to come all the way in and sit all the way down. And what I mean by that is we all have a lot of things going on. I get it. I understand. And for a moment, I'm hoping that we can take some time for some professional development in a way that we can increase our knowledge. If there's one or two or three things that we can take from today's time together, it would be worth your time to sit with that for a moment, come all the way in and sit all the way down with these concepts. Two, I'm going to ask you to really try and apply this information to yourself. We can oftentimes apply it towards others, the youth we serve, or the families. But today, let's look at ourselves. Let's look at our professional lives and personal lives. And three, anytime that we talk about trauma or anything that may be linked to trauma, I think it's also important that we exercise our own self-care as we talk about these subjects. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail, or I hope not to bring anything up that's triggering for anybody, but it's also just important to know that anytime we touch on these subjects, that it can be the case. Let's start really quickly with just defining trauma. According to SAMHSA, trauma can be defined by the 3 E's. So an individual's trauma results from an event or series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as a physical or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning. This could be mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. So the way I tend to look at this is something that overwhelms the system. The inability to manage the weight or the gravity of a situation. And it may be because of the situation itself, or it may be because the individual doesn't have the foundational capacity to manage that system. So trauma, as defined by SAMHSA, this is where we'll that. And also, we'll talk a little bit about the pervasiveness of trauma. Sometimes we look at trauma as something that maybe happens on occasion. Depend on the national studies that you pull from, you'll find that anywhere from 55 to 90% of us have experienced at least one traumatic event. I don't think that's shocking for anybody. We know that the average ACEs score is just above 4.5 for us. For those that have taken our ACEs scores, we understand what the adverse childhood experience score is and what it means. Individuals report experiencing on average, here it says nearly 5 traumatic events in their lifetime. And the experience of trauma, it's no longer a rare exception. This is the rule. No one gets through unscathed. And we all have our stories. And sometimes I think we've been led to believe that trauma and its impact is for someone else somewhere, and that applies to them. And I'm for sure here today to push against that stigma. We all have our trauma history. We all have our touches with that. Very few people that I ever talk to or present to have had zero. And so it's important to know that it is pervasive, and this applies to all of us. So for the rest of this presentation, instead of me just giving you bland slides and information, I'm going to try to frame this in a creative way that helps you to remember these concepts. So we're all familiar with the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy and her lions and tigers and bears. In fact, I was thinking about just doing the whole presentation on Dorothy and her own trauma and what she experienced in the movie. I didn't do that, but what I am going to do is talk about trauma, not through lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, but through cats, sparrows, and zebras. And we can still keep the oh my. So by cats, I'm going to point to our environment. I'm going to look at where we spend our time, maybe. What I mean by environment is what we consume, what is around us. Any external stimuli, anything that's coming at us could be considered environment. By sparrows, I'm going to be looking at our internal responses, our internal process. Internal process, I'm going to refer to as thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and belief systems. And finally, with zebras, I'm going to refer to behavior. And behavior is anything that we can observe, anything that we see happening in the world around us and how we interact with the world. So I want to start really quickly by, I believe I'm going to say this, I'm probably going to butcher this name, but his name is YIC, and he's an Estonian neuroscientist. He's a really interesting researcher who became famous for his experiments with rats and how he linked that to behavior. So I want to kind of highlight his work on one study where he had researchers measure and observe playful behaviors in young rats. So these are young rats that are placed in a cage, brand new little babies, and he watches them begin to interact and play. And so these rats, for the first 4 days, were in their cage and had a high degree of playful behavior. And what he did is he introduced one single cat hair into their environment. Now, it's worth noting that the cat hair was new to them. They had never experienced a cat in their lives. They had never seen a cat. And it was only one single cat hair. And what he found out was that the playful behavior in those cats or in those mice completely dropped off. The little rats, as soon as that cat hair was in that environment, their play reduced dramatically. Now, he took the cat hair away. And after that cat hair was removed, it was maybe as shocking as the reduction in playful behavior is the fact that they never returned back to their normal play. That state of homeostasis was never regained. And one of the leading theories on this study is that our environment, or that these little rats, their environment was breached. The trust was breached. It was traumatic. For reasons unconscious to these little rats, they had never seen a cat. Somehow they knew that that was a threat. And these little rats were aware of this violation. So the theory suggests that the environment, and especially once that environment had been breached, they weren't able to regain the trust of that environment. If you're linking this in any way to your youth, you'd be correct. There's that link that exists for our youth. But again, this is going to be looking at ourselves. We're going to take a look in. And so I want to start by with environment by looking at our organizational environments. What do our places of work feel like? What is it for us to come to work. I want to shine a light on this for a second, because when we start talking about an organization, we have to understand that we all play a part in this, that the culture of that organization is a dynamic between all folks that are interfacing with that organization. And so it's a collective group experience. And some players arguably may have more power or more influence within that. We can all kind of look back and see that in our lives, of maybe where we've played a role or others have played roles based on their position or based on their personality. But it's important for us to ask, how do our workplaces feel? Do we like going to work? Do we feel good about going to work? We might enjoy some things about our work, maybe some of the people we work with, maybe not so much, I don't know. Or do we dread it? Is it something that we are, avoiding and just struggle through? What do we carry with us to work? What do we bring from our personal lives into our work in a way that becomes distracting, or makes us less efficient or effective at what we do? So why is this important? Well, on the slide, and this comes from the Trauma Stewardship book, it says that organizations themselves have the potential to either mitigate or exacerbate the efforts of trauma exposure for all their workers. The way those workers then manage trauma will in turn have an impact on the experience of the already traumatized clients. So what this says to me is that we, in approaching our work and the way that we interface with our work and the way that we promote environments of safety and the way that we promote environments that are trauma informed, including ourselves, trickles down in a way that actually impacts our clients. And I think we can understand this. So my question then becomes, how are you all doing with this? How does it feel in your work? How are your environments, and are there places for improvement? And while I don't think we're going to open the mic and have a discussion on this, I think it's important that we sit in the space and think about that. And maybe a good way to ask this question is what are the cat hairs that exist within our environments? What are the threats that we perceive that are preventing us from being able to professionally or personally be at our best? So safety is important. I want to share this slide on safety. Throughout the organization, staff and the people they serve, whether they are children or adults, need to feel physically and psychologically safe. Physically and psychologically safe. The physical setting is safe, and the interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. I'm sure all of us could sit down and talk about the coworkers that they can rely on and the difference that makes in our work. The idea that we can lean and have these interpersonal interactions that really ultimately set the foundation for our work with our youth populations and with the families that we serve. How important that is to have the physical and psychological presence of safety. Using a trauma-informed approach, this means that a program or the organization or the system is trauma-informed when it realizes the widespread impact of trauma. I think we all understand that. And we also understand that there's a potential path for recovery. And it recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients and in our families and in our staff and others involved with the system. And it responds by fully integrating this knowledge about trauma into its policies, into its procedures, into its practices, and it seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. For those working with the JJS population, I worked with them for 3 years, and I helped to teach different trauma-informed principles within that time with them. And one of the things that stood out to me was the ACEs score, of our youth that were entering the system and the ACEs score of our youth that were exiting the system. And one thing that was apparent was that the ACEs score got higher by entering the system. By being locked up in JJS care or in incarceration in any situation is and can be traumatic and can increase and promote re-traumatization. And we need to be aware of that and actively work against that. Many of you probably see that in your own work. So a key point is adopting a trauma-informed approach is not accomplished through any single particular technique or checklist. I'm not going to give that to you in today's professional development. It will require constant attention, caring awareness, sensitivity, and possibly even a cultural change at an organizational level. And again, on that organizational level, we all have a responsibility to that. So from a personal and professional environment, to sum that up, it matters. Our environments matter. We need to recognize what cat hairs exist in our organization. We need to recognize what threatens us in fully doing our job and ability to do our job and to take care of ourselves. We need to think about how that applies to the lives of our families and how that will trickle down. And we have to ask ourselves, what does it feel like to come into contact with us as an organization or as a person? Also, look at maybe how we're establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries in our lives. By healthy boundaries, what I'm suggesting is things like, are we able to keep work at work? How do you do with that? The work's difficult enough. To take it home with us can be even more difficult. As a profession, professionals, are we aware of where our stuff ends and where the client's begins? Sometimes that can get blurry. Again, we have our own histories and our own past that can sometimes influence how we interface with others. And then maybe another place to look at is, what are we promoting? What are we sharing with others? What does our workspaces feel like in terms of gossip, of fear, of stress, of demands? Right now, because I work for the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, many of you are aware that there's a big merger on the state level, the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services. That in and of itself can be stressful. These aren't necessarily things that we always have control over, but we do have a responsibility to them and to asking ourselves, how are we promoting this, or to what degree? So I want to give you a quick skill. This skill is something that you can use for yourselves. You can use this for clients. But when it comes to environment, one skill, it's very simple, that I've found that is very effective. Anytime that I'm in a situation, or that I found a client in a situation where we're feeling overwhelmed, or we're feeling triggered, or in some sort of state of crisis, the skill is very easy. It is, one, we decrease stimuli. So we talk about environment as external stimuli. First step is to decrease stimuli. Turn the volume down, quote unquote. Find the place where you can reduce that incoming message, whatever that may be. Again, when you're overwhelmed or in crisis. And two is to increase structure. What is structure for you? I believe that everybody thrives under structure. I think our society thrives under structure. We have to have some level of structure, some more than others, but we have to have structure. And one of the ways that we learned this was through the solid object model. The solid object model, if you haven't heard of it, it's a great model to understand that when people are in crisis, when people are falling, when you are falling, it's your natural reaction to reach out, to grab hold of something, or to catch yourself in your fall. And we're looking for solid objects to grab a hold of. In the lives of the youth that you serve, you become the solid object in those lives. You become the structure. the stabilization for them. And it is so important that we take a look at that and ask ourselves, how can we better promote that, and how can we better be a solid object? It's going to take place through self-care, and the first place that I'm going to suggest that you take a look at your own personal self-care is in your environment. Okay, let's transition away from the environment for a second. I want to talk about our next area, and that is the internal. And I really like this quote from Canadian physician Gabor Mate. If you're not familiar with him, Google him. Go find his YouTube talks. He's a great author and speaker. Talks a lot about childhood development and trauma, addiction, and has some really great books out there. His quote is that it's not what happens to you externally that defines the trauma, but what happens internally to you as a result of it. So let me rephrase that maybe in a little bit different of a way. An event can be traumatic, but where the real trauma takes place is how this is internalized by a person. So we all go through traumatic experiences, but trauma takes place when it is internalized. So we're going to talk a little bit about the internal process. And by internal, again, we were talking about thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and belief systems. This is unique to all of us, each one of us, based on our experience, our genetics, our history, background, culture, everything is different for all of us. We all look at life through a different lens. And I guess one way to look at this, ACT therapy, so acceptance commitment therapy, really talks about the fusing with ideas, the fusing with thoughts or feelings. So a thought might be something that is maybe a first stage where a thought pops up. Cognitive behavior therapy might say that we'll challenge that thought through thinking errors and we'll look to disprove or mitigate that thought and its influence in our lives. Where ACT therapy tends to say it's not necessarily that the thought pops up, it's how deeply that fuses with a person. So a thought might be a surface level. Okay, a thought comes in, maybe a thought comes out. But the further we go down the rabbit hole, a thought can then move innocently enough into a feeling. That feeling can develop into an attitude. And that attitude can eventually become a belief system, something that we fuse with very closely. So let me introduce you to the sparrows. I'm going to hope this works. I'm going to try and play this on your screen. And I'll try to make sure there's no sound. But as I'm talking about this, I hope that you can see the video. Everybody see the video? Okay. And that we can kind of pay attention to these birds, these sparrows. And start to ask ourselves, well, first of all, if you haven't gone out to go watch the sparrows, go watch the sparrows. I go on a trail kind of by my house. There's some open fields and it extends out to the lake. And so I get these sparrows that will group. And they fly in formation. And they also do this really interesting thing on the ground where they all go to the ground and they're in the same spot. And then on one side, say that's the right side, few sparrows jump over to the left side, and they're constantly rolling through the fields in a way where those that are making contact in the center can sit, can eat, can get the grubs or whatever they're looking for, while the others slowly rotate through. And the reason they do this, if you guys, many of you probably know, but the reason why they group together, and I think it's coming up, you'll see a bigger bird kind of enter the scene. Maybe it's already passed, but these bigger birds of prey are also in the area. And when you're down in my neck of the woods, you'll see the owls, you'll see the red-tailed hawks, and you'll see them. And come into the area and perch, and they're watching, and they're looking for those sparrows that they can pick off. But when sparrows group together, and this happens with fish as well, that throws off their prey. We're safer when we're connected. We feel safer. Sparrows are a very social creature, and like sparrows, we also are social creatures. It's a very important need that we have to feel connected, to feel belonging, and to feel like we're a part of something. I'm sure you feel, or you're familiar with Brene Brown. I love this quote from her, and this really is where connection and trauma connect. And that is, connection is why we are here. It is what gives us purpose, meaning in our lives, and without it, there is suffering. Trauma ultimately is suffering. Our goal is to mitigate that suffering. We know that, like these sparrows who feel safety, we too feel safer when we feel that deep need for connection, that deep desire has been met, that we feel that there's a sense of belonging. In fact, we desire it so much so that you'll see that we'll actually seek negative attention just to fit in. I mean, I'm sure you have youth that you could see this in, where maybe negative attention is still attention, and that fulfills their ability to get along with others and be with others. But at the same time, from an observer looking in, you know that they're really not fitting in really well, and that it's actually probably a more harmful dynamic within that relationship. And this goes back to our ACEs. ACEs aren't just that negative things happen. It's that negative things happen, or adverse experiences happen, in the absence of these key protective factors. These key protective factors, connection, or feeling as though you belong, as a protective factor. So I want you to think about that for a moment. I'm going to point to our SHARP survey. So for those of you who don't know, we do the SHARP survey every other year. This is 2021 will be the next year that we do the SHARP survey. And we ask students in grades 6, 8, 10, and 12 to answer a set of questions. And this question is an addition to the 2019 survey, which is asking questions around social isolation. Again, feeling like you don't belong. Those 4 questions that they asked are right there along the bottom, and I apologize about the size, it's a little small, but I'll read them. And basically it asks us, within the last 7 days, have I felt left out? Have I felt that people barely know me? Have I felt isolated from others? Or this last one really gets me. It's, have I felt that people are around me, but not with me? We know, based on the responses, that this is something that that our youth are feeling, and that is taking place. And we can understand that. All of us get that on a very human, fundamental level. We know what it feels like not to belong. I'm guessing that there's been at least some time in your life that you felt that you didn't fit in or didn't belong. And the key point here is, it doesn't necessarily even matter if this is true. It does not matter if it's rooted in truth or not. What matters is that the experience of the individual and how they've internalized that idea feels true to them. This is why 2 people can have the same exact experience and feel completely different ways. It's important that when we have these key pieces of what it means to develop, to engage with the world, and when they're challenged, something as important as connection and belonging is challenged, it can have a real negative impact on us internally and how we see the world. So I want you to just for a moment pause to reflect. And again, because this is a time when you can think back and feel the times in your life where maybe you've been disconnected or not included. Maybe you feel that today in some ways. Maybe that's happening for you now, or maybe that's something in the past, or wherever that's been for you. But how does this impact you when you're in that space? Again, as a personal reflection, as we go back through and we look at ourselves and how this applies to us, not to them, I'm going to ask you to look inward for a moment. And some of us might really relate to this example of feeling like I don't belong. In fact, I'm sure that many of us have, but this is just one of a number of different examples of narratives, of storylines that we fuse with. So I highlighted connection. I'm going to actually throw a few more out there. What I want you to do is maybe pay attention to what kind of comes up for you as I talk about this. Again, this isn't an exercise to trigger anyone, but I think it's important to understand where our stuff is. So looking inward, I'm going to ask, has anybody had this narrative? I know if you're anything like me, or if your voice is anything like mine, I've had this one. So pay attention to what comes up for you. I'm not good enough, or I'm unworthy. I'll be left out or forgotten. Oftentimes, this is rooted in fear of being unloved. Maybe you've had feelings of I'm worthless, the fear of low value, or the perception of low value. Some people identify with having no purpose. This is the idea that who you are, or who your authentic self is, and you struggle with that identity. And again, very common. Here's one, and I have a typo here. It's not I can do it, it's I can't do it. Can't do it. I'm helpless. I'm incompetent. We get this a lot. Learned helplessness is something that you're going to see quite a bit the more and more you work with the youth. And here's the one. I'll be deprived, or I'll be in pain. This is rooted in neglect, and also can be found in parentification roles. Youth that had to take on maybe more than they needed to, or I shouldn't even say youth, but those of us that maybe have had to take on more than we had to at different times in our lives. They're only out for themselves. Has anybody ever felt that it's difficult to trust? Maybe felt being controlled by others, or maybe others were out to harm you. This is also very common, and also the last couple, it'll be taken from me. People are out to take things from me and don't leave me. Really a fear of loss. These folks oftentimes can become doormats. They can't say no. They struggle to be assertive, and can present itself in those ways. So I'm guessing that some of these stood out for you. I'm hoping they did, and that's the goal, is to ask yourselves kind of where are my things in this? Where does it arise for me? When we know what it feels like, we can better empathize with others. I think that's a big piece of this, is knowing ourselves and knowing where this feels like for us can help us in connecting with others, but also in normalizing the experience, right? I mean, saying these things, talking about these things puts us in a vulnerable space. And sometimes we feel all alone when we start talking about these things. Sometimes we feel like we're the only ones in the world that have ever felt worthless. And again, this is something that we know is very common and very directly tied to the trauma, to our histories, to the things that we've experienced in the past, and how we've internalized different messages at different times in our lives. So my final point on this is that it's not that we have had these thoughts, but it's how we've fused with them and how they continue to play out in our lives today in a way that keeps us from living a full and fulfilling life. So the skill that I'd like to introduce to you is from Gabor Mate's book, It's from When the Body Says No. I think it's chapter 4. Great book, great read. If you're looking for one, add it to your list. And he's talking about emotional competency. And so really briefly, I'll just go over emotional competency. And I think it's easy for us in this field to see so many cases, to have so many touches with trauma that we start to get a little bit numb. And so the first goal of emotional competency is to keep that capacity to feel. We have to have that capacity to feel. We're not suggesting that you turn the volume down on that. You need to feel. But the second thing that you need to have is the ability to express these thoughts and feelings effectively in your work and in your interpersonal relationships. And then three, the one that sticks out for me, and I think is most important, is we have to have the facility to distinguish between the psychological responses that are pertinent to the current situation and those that represent residue from the past. Emotional residue. If you don't come away with anything from this presentation other than that, that is, to me, like one of the key points. We all have emotional residue. As professionals, our job is to recognize what is coming from the past, what are we bringing to this, and what is important to the situation at hand. And being able to then use that awareness to genuinely access the needs that require us to do so in the moment. If I am having an emotional reaction and it is pertinent to that situation, I need to also have the skill to act upon that in a way that allows me to still engage with the world around me. So again, emotional competency, there's a 10,000 brief overview, great book, and you'll get a lot more out of it if you actually read it. But emotional competency, great skill to strengthen. Okay, let's move into behavior. I'm going to try and bust through this really quickly, Amanda. I know we're running a little low on time, so I'll go through quickly. Behavior isn't something someone has. Rather, it emerges from the interaction of a person's biology, their past experience, and the immediate context of a situation. So let's talk a little bit about zebras. Zebras. I'm also going to butcher this name, Robert Sapolsky. And he's a little bit more famous. Maybe some of you guys have heard his work. He's written a book on why zebras don't get ulcers. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about zebras and type 1 and type 2 errors. So if you're a zebra, imagine you're a zebra and you're out in the savannah and there's a rustle in the bushes and you hear the grass and you believe it to be a lion and you run away. Like any good zebra, you run away. And come to find out it was just the wind. You have just made a type 1 error. You ran away from the wind. However, if you're a zebra on the savannah and you hear the rustle in the bushes and you believe it's the wind, but it's actually a lion, you've just made a type 2 error. So that's the difference between a type 1 and a type 2 error. Now, zebras that make type 2 errors, they don't exist anymore. They get eaten very quickly. Evolutionary psychologists believe that we are the result of type 1 error folks, that our genetic past comes from our human ancestors who were literally on the savannah and ran away from all the scary things because we had to. Now, running away from scary things, that sacrifices a little bit of energy. We also might look a little foolish, but the end result is less negative than if we were to make a type 2 error and have much higher costs. Why is this important? Because if we only look at the behavior, if we only look at what a zebra is doing, what we are doing, or maybe what the youth are doing, then we're missing the bigger picture. There's a bigger picture at play here. And zebras that run away have the ability, unlike us, to return to good, to get away, to group back up and begin grazing again. What's unique to humans is we don't forget very often. We remember the rustle in the bush, and we worry and we ruminate about this. And this is why some of our I shouldn't say some of our, but why one of our greatest mental health concerns is anxiety, and how we manage and deal with anxiety. But not necessarily anxiety. What I want to focus on is the actual behavior. So I'm going to focus on behavior on this and try to explain it through this idea of arrows. Arrows are the traumas that come into our lives. Based on that arrow, based on that trauma, based on that thing happening to us, we interpret. Again, that's the internal. But the conclusion ends up being the behavior. In context, it makes sense why a zebra runs away from everything all the time. In fact, I don't even have to be the zebra to run away. It can be my buddy Jerry over there, and he might hear it and he perks up and says, "Oh my gosh." And I react to him and we both run away. We don't even have to be the ones that experience it much of the time. The arrows in our lives can be direct, or they can even be indirect. It's what we call vicarious trauma. It's what we call secondary trauma. Just having those issues in front of us can be a form of trauma, but especially when we've been impacted directly. When those arrows have hit us personally, we receive that as a message. That message then influences our behavior. So let me give you an example of this really quickly. I was working with a client, and we'll call him Tom. And when Tom came to see me, he was struggling with his relationships. He was having a hard time with a divorce situation from his past that came up, and also getting back into relationships with women. We dug into Tom's history. We talked a lot, and come to find out, his parents were divorced at age 9. And it was ugly, and they didn't get along. What basically happened was, on Fridays, Dad would come pick up Tom. And Tom and his parents, again, ugly divorce. Fridays, Dad would come pick up Tom and his little sister. But because it was such an ugly divorce, Mom wouldn't allow Dad to come into the house. So they went to the curb. And they sat on the curb, or waited on the curb, until Dad arrived. Just so happened to be that Friday was also garbage day in their neighborhood. Garbage day meant everybody brought their trash out to the curb. And so Tom spent his Fridays, excuse me, waiting on the curb with the garbage for his dad to pick him up. He internalized this message of his parents' divorce in a way that he said, "I'm garbage." The direct arrow came from his parents' divorce. The message he internalized was that he is garbage. This impacted his relationship specifically with women. His mom was the one that sent him to the curb. He actually blamed his mom for the divorce and what was taking place, although it probably was, as we know, much more than just one person's fault. But Tom's 9-year-old little brain did the math, and his reaction 30 years later was that I'm not worthy of love, that he withdrew from love, and he withdrew from affection. Tom's behavior in the moment was to not trust women, to not trust relationships. This is how it played out for Tom, but it makes sense when we think about it as a type 1 error. When we understand that his little brain was doing the math, and that he needs to run away from those things that he has learned to be scary or hurtful or painful in the past. What are your arrows? This is a very aggressive slide, and I apologize for that, and we won't spend much time on it because we're running short. But it's important that we know where our stuff ends and where our clients begins. Our self-care relies on us knowing ourselves and actively working to mitigate the impact of our arrows in our lives. Like, like any Mel Gibson movie, you would know that you get shot with an arrow and that it doesn't just heal. You break off that arrow and it probably sits and festers, right? And it doesn't go away nicely. And what I will say, I've experienced this, and I'm sure many of you, is that I have my own arrows and they're festering. And when somebody else's stuff rubs up against my stuff, I feel it and I know it and I'm aware of it. And it may change my reaction or my behavior in that moment. It's important, again, for us to be aware of this and to actively work on our self-care pieces around that. Okay, let's go quickly here. Knowing your arrows matter. I'm going to point to the book again. This is a great quote out of the book on trauma stewardship. And that is one of the most profound influences on trauma stewardship is who we are as individuals. What is our own history of hardship, pain, suffering, and trauma? What resources were available to help us? And what led us to the work we do? The more personal our connection to the work, the greater the gifts that we bring to it. Again, I started with this idea of ikigai. I asked why we're here. My guess is this all is interrelated. Why we're here, well, I believe behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're here because we chose this. Finally, as an organization and as individuals, this matters. You have a commitment to your youth. You have a commitment to your families. You have a commitment to yourself. Be a little selfish. This is not optional. You know, being the best version of yourself within your work can inspire change in others. You know, how we lead and how we interface with our colleagues, agencies, you know, all of that's important. But I'm leaving you with homework. I purposely didn't want to give you a list of these are the to take care of yourself, or here's a book report on this great book. I purposely wanted to give you something to get you thinking, and then to give you homework and ask yourself to go know yourself, go figure it out, do a little digging and find out what works for you. Start by looking in your environment. What are you consuming? What's around you? What does that look like for you personally? Take responsibility of your internal process. Shine a light on it. Ask yourself, why am I leading myself to this conclusion or that conclusion? And if you don't know, work backwards. Ask yourself from behavior on back. Another thing is projecting into the world through your behavior something that inspires hope. If I could give you 3 tips around self-care, it's 3 H's. Sorry, I shouldn't say 3 tips, but 1 tip, it is the 3 H's. So here it is. Is your self-care helpful? If it's helpful, that's good. That's great. But that's not the whole puzzle. We all know that many people drown themselves in alcoholism, and it's very effective at pushing things away for that moment. It is helpful. But the second H is it healthy? So is it helpful? Is it healthy? And the final H is, does it inspire hope? Does it inspire hope in myself? And does it inspire hope in others? Exercise self-care, guys. It's important. Your batteries are important. Recharge them often. I believe as professionals, we have a duty to this. Yeah, and I apologize about going a little bit over, but I'll leave you with this quote. This quote is Nelson Mandela's famous inaugural speech, but it's actually Marianne Williamson's work, so I'll give her credit. As we let our own light shine and operate at our best, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we liberate ourselves from our fears, and I added, and our traumas, our presence automatically liberates others. I think that's what we're doing here. And I appreciate all the work you all do to help with others. So I will not open this up for questions and comments. Instead, I will turn this over to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Scott. Wishing now we'd given you a little more time perhaps, but I guess we live and we learn as we go through these. That was amazing. I'm seeing lots of comments in the chat, excuse me. Several that were to me privately that this was exactly what was needed. It was very timely. A few requests to even have you back next March to continue this learning. So for those that didn't get the information, the book Scott was referring to is Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. And Kelly's already got it on her Kindle. So there's an audiobook away because I will need the audiobook too. So thank you so much, Scott. I have Scott's contact information if anybody needs to reach out afterward. And then Scott, I'll definitely be in touch to get you on tap for another webinar. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you.
All right, to keep us on track with our time, next we have Dustin Jansen and Chuck Foster. And it looks like they are both online. So you are welcome to turn on your cameras and microphones. And Dustin, do you want me to share your PowerPoint, or would you like to share it from your computer?
Oh, you can do it if you can.
I sure can. Give me just a moment. And if I remember right, Dustin, you're going first.
Yeah, I'll take a few minutes and go over some of the legal, political aspects of Indian stuff, and then Chuck will take over on cultural things. But I think we need to go over both of them a little bit. But yeah, my name's Dustin Jansen. I'm the director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, and I also teach American Indian Studies at Utah Valley University, and currently work as a judge for the Confederate Tribes of the Goshen Reservation. I'm here with my entire office, which includes just two other people, is James Toledo, and who's our program manager, and Dominic Kalahaftiwa. And so if you call our office and you get either one of us, you should be able to get all the information you need from us. We try to share as much as we can with one another. So I'll just get going. The seals you see here they represent the 8 tribes that are found in Utah. I think of a lot of times we don't imagine that there are 8 tribes in Utah, but I mean, and that seems like a lot, but there are other states that have in the 20s. They have like 20 tribes in their state. I grew up in one. New Mexico and Arizona right next to us had a lot of tribes also. But the tribes in Utah, starting from the south, are the Navajo Nation, which is the largest reservation in the United States. And then we get the SIL, we see the San Juan Southern Paiute. They don't actually have a land base, but they have offices there on the Navajo Reservation. There's an agreement between the Navajo Reservation and the San Juan Southern Paiute about a land donation to San Juan. It's just sitting in Congress, still needs to go through. You go a little further, you have the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah. And the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah is located in Cedar City. And you come a little further up north and go east, you have the Ute tribe that's in Fort Duchesne and on the Uinta and Ouray Reservation just outside of Roosevelt. And go all the way up north, you have the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. They have offices in Brigham City. They're currently trying to acquire some land in Washakie, Utah. That's in litigation right now. They're not part of the litigation, but there's litigation around their ancestral lands that they're trying to recover, and they put their hat in the ring to try to recover those lands. So we wish them the best. And then if you go west of Salt Lake, towards Tooele, and just southwest of Tooele, you have the Skull Valley Band of Goshu. And then even further west, about an hour south of Wendover, Utah, or Wendover, Nevada, you have the Confederated Tribes of the Goshu Indians. And, these tribes, along with many others, used to occupy this whole state of Utah, what we call state of Utah, and their territories were ginormous. And sometimes we like to acknowledge that. We like to acknowledge that, you know, that we are on land that was originally inhabited. You know, I'm in Provo right now, and you know, at this time of year, the Ute tribe would be all camped out along in Provo, you know, all along the shoreline of the lake here, because there's fresh water coming from the Provo River, and they'd be getting ready to go back into the mountains for the summer. And so we just like to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that, you know, the good work that they did in maintaining this area and taking care of it, and their continued stewardship over this land. And so I think that's important. I want to just make sure that all these tribes were acknowledged right now. And you know, I said that the Navajo Nation was the largest reservation in the United States, and it is. The second largest reservation in the United States is the Uinta and Ouray Reservation also. So we got part of the Navajo Nation, which goes into New Mexico and Arizona and Utah, and all of the Ute Tribes Reservation is in Utah. All right, let's go next slide. Okay, I share this a lot. Wilma Mankiller was the first female president of the Cherokee Nation. She was their vice president for a while, and their president got really sick, and she transitioned into president, and then she ran again on her own and won. And she did a lot of wonderful things, a lot of powerful things as they pertain to women, but also as they pertain to Native people. She said something, this isn't a direct quote, this is actually like a really long thing that she said, but in summary, she says, public perception creates public policy. How we see people determines how we treat people, right? If you see people as dangerous, you're probably going to treat them like they're dangerous. And I think it's important that she used the word public policy, because our public policy is expressed in the laws of our nation and the laws of our state. If you really want to know how people think, what people think about you, look at the laws that affect you directly, and you'll find that out. So I hope, you know, with this presentation and along with Chuck's words, people will see Native people in a different way, in a good way, and treat them in a good way. And so I'll just keep that right there for a second, let you look at that and just really absorb it. Public perception creates public policy. And, you know, for some of us, it might take some changes in how we see people to change our behavior towards those people. So let's go to the next slide. I ask people a lot what an Indian tribe is. I ask Indian students this because I teach at Utah Valley University, and I'll say, hey, what's a tribe? And, you know, and if you've never had to think about it, it might be hard to articulate. And so I provide a couple definitions about what a tribe is. And one of the biggest definitions I get from people is that, well, it's a group of indigenous people. They share a bloodline, right? They share lineage. They're related to one another. There's a kinship there. And they have a set of cultural and spiritual values that they probably follow. They probably have a common language. They probably have a geographical land base where they live, and they probably have some type of institutional authority, some type of political authority. Okay, and that's what we call an ethno definition. This is really a racial. It leans more towards a racial definition of what an Indian tribe is. But Native people, they're just not subject to that racial definition. Let's go to the next slide. They are also subject to a legal definition. Okay, so the legal definition of what a tribe is, that contains a lot of what that racial definition carried, but there's something a little more to it. So a legal definition of what a tribe is, it's a group of indigenous people recognized by the federal government, meaning the United States, as a sovereign nation. And so that's part one. There's this recognition by the federal government that you are a political entity. And then on top of that, there's a government to government relationship that exists between this Indian nation and the federal government. Okay. The federal government doesn't work with Native people as a race. They work with Native people as a separate government entity. And I think that's important to understand, because yes, Native people are racially indigenous to the United States, but if they're part of a federally recognized tribe, they are also legally Indian, not just racially Indian. And being legally part of an indigenous government provides some privileges, just as being a citizen of the United States has certain privileges. Okay, so I always share this. If let's say I'm running around Europe, some European country, I don't know, and someone frames me for a big crime, and I do not want to get caught by this European country's law enforcement, and I take off, I run, and I'm trying to seek refuge somewhere. In the movies, where do you normally go? Normally, you run to the embassy, right? When Jason Bourne was being chased by the French or German police, you know, that he was going, he walked to the embassy, he flashed his passport. He goes, U.S. citizen. They let him in, and when the foreign law enforcement tried to go in, the Marine Corps steps in and says, no, you can't come in here. Why is he able to do that? Is Jason Bourne able to seek refuge in the U.S. embassy in a foreign country because he's white? No, it has nothing to do with his race. He got into the embassy because he's a citizen of the United States. And being a citizen of the United States, it doesn't matter what your race is. It's your status, your legal status as a citizen of the United States. And so there's a privilege associated with our citizenship. And Indian people that are enrolled and members of a federally recognized tribe also carry some privileges. Okay. And those privileges were probably granted normally through a treaty process, where the United States government says, we recognize you, Indian tribe, as a government, and we're going to make an agreement together. And this agreement is called a treaty. Because you don't make treaties with a race of people, you make treaties with another government, right? And so an Indian person, again, I'll say this, can be racially Indian, but they could also be legally Indian, meaning they are members of a federally recognized tribe. All right. So in the United States today, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. 8 of them are in Utah, and there are about 200 tribes that are not federally recognized. Okay, some may have state recognition, but some may just be organized as community groups after, since European contact came, they never established themselves as a federally recognized political entity. There's about 5.5 million individual Indians among the 574 federally recognized tribes. And so your chances are you interact with Native people. There's a lot of them. If you work in government, chances are you are going to work with tribal governments on some level. And when I teach political science at UVU, I let my kids know that. I let my students know, if you plan on working in government, you can plan that at some point in your career, you're going to work with an indigenous nation and a tribe. And I hope I can prepare you in a way that gives you a heads up on how to do that correctly. All right, next one. So you've probably heard this word being thrown around a lot when it comes to tribes, is sovereignty. When government leaders are asked to define tribal sovereignty, it gets really messy, and you can do a YouTube search on that and watch all the sovereignty definition fails. But I'll just give you a quick thing. But I always show this bundle of sticks, and I say this bundle of sticks represents sovereignty. And in this bundle of sticks, each stick in this bundle represents a sovereign power. And you ask yourself, what powers do sovereigns have? And the easiest way I can explain that is to ask, I usually ask people what makes the United States sovereign? What can they do? Okay. And what sticks are necessary, what sticks aren't, right? What powers aren't. And so sometimes people will say, well, you have to be financially independent. And then I ask, is the United States financially independent? Do we owe money to anybody? Are we in the clear? Are we debt free as a nation? No, we're not. You need some will say you need a military, but there are countries around the world that don't have militaries. And there's some countries that have a military that aren't allowed to use them outside of their borders. And we still recognize them as sovereigns. Costa Rica doesn't have a military, but we say that they're a sovereign nation. Japan has a military, but they can't operate outside of Japan since World War II, but we still recognize them as a sovereign. Everyone borrows money from each other in this current system. So it's probably not financial power that makes you a sovereign, but they all help, right? There's hundreds of powers that helps solidify the sovereignty of a nation, and losing one does not make you less sovereign, or agreeing not to exercise certain sticks, or agreeing to say, well, I'm going to take this stick out for now, okay, but I still have my bundle, and so sovereignty isn't just one thing, it's many things, and it's many powers that can be exercised. Next slide, please. All right, so, but in summary, I will say this, if you gave this as an answer to what sovereignty was, it is the right of a nation to govern itself, and the ability to foster and nurture relationships with neighboring sovereign entities. It's your ability to have relationships with other sovereigns on a government to government level. Okay, that's important. And that's not my calendar. Just kidding. All right. So it's the ability to foster and nurture relations with other sovereigns, and the right of a nation to govern itself. All right, let's go on to the next one. I asked a lot of people, where do tribal governments get their authority? If we look, so to answer that, I usually ask, where does the United States get its authority to act? And most people will correctly say it's rooted in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution enumerates powers to each branch of government. They say the legislative government can do this, or the legislative branch can do this, the executive branch can do this, and the judicial branch can do this. And in the 10th Amendment, it says, and anything not mentioned in here, that's not set aside for federal power is designated to the state and its people. So the US Constitution says this is what the federal government can do, and anything we don't mention, the states can do. But where do tribal governments fit in there? And the reality is they don't. Tribal governments, their authority, their sovereign powers pre-exist the US Constitution. And that sounds like a big statement, like a wild statement to make. But we know this is true because when European nations first began landing on the shores of what we call the United States, they entered into treaties with the native people that lived here. And the only way for a tribe to enter into a treaty with England or France or Spain was for England or France or Spain to recognize them as a political entity, as a government. Because treaties exist between governments, not between a government and a race of people. It exists between governments. So all the treaties and agreements made between tribal governments and European nations were absorbed into the United States after the American Revolution. The United States accepted those agreements and recognized that tribes were in fact political governments that have existed since before colonization and settlement of European nations. So they've always had it. And that makes things a little difficult in government today when we try to exercise power, when the state wants to do things in their state, but they find a reservation located within their state, and it creates an opportunity for two governments to work together and solve some issues. And it works the same way between tribes and the federal government. Now, I believe that's my last slide. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. So because we're a little short on time, what I'll do is I'll just, if you have questions, if you want to write them in the chat, I can start addressing those, but I want to make sure that Chuck has time to share his information. And if I don't get to all of them, I think we're setting aside about 20 minutes to answer questions, 15 or 20 minutes at the end. So if you want to start putting questions in the chat, I can start answering those. Or if you just want to wait till our question and answer period, that's fine also. If you want to if you want to pay attention, make sure your full attention's on Chuck, which I totally understand. All right, so I'll turn it over to Chuck. Thanks, Chuck.
Hey, thanks, Dustin. Greetings, everybody. Yat Ebin, to all those people who are listening. That's a greeting that we do from the Navajo Nation, and the greeting from a Navajo. Yat Ebin do kia ani shlan tseslani bashis chin hanagani shnal kapash che kada den shlan le tsehat sada ada nidana shado Utah State Board of Education ebanash nisho ade le orm Utah ade shagun. What I just said was a greeting that often we give to an audience in the Navajo tradition. We name the clans that we belong to. And the greeting I did this morning was from my maternal side, which is my mother, is the Kia'ani, which is a Tower and House clan. And I was born for the Mountain Cove people. That's my dad's side. And my maternal is the Edgewater people. And my maternal is, for my grandfather's side, is the Walk Around people. So those are the clans that I come from. So each time that we do introduce ourselves to an audience, those are the clans that we come from. This is a part of the cultural aspects. That's the assignment that was given to me in terms of what I like to give my introduction as. I also have Renee Medina, who's my assistant at Utah State Board of Education. She's gonna, either her or Amanda's gonna put on my PowerPoint. And Renee has been an instrument for our office, and there's only two of us. It's her and me. So we don't have a very, very large office. This is something that a picture here, a diagram, you know, if we were to look down from space, this is what Utah would look like. And all those little red marks are the reservations that you find in Utah. And as Dustin indicated, that you know, the present time, this is the land at base that we live on. And before that, this was all red. So, you know, and we have 8 tribes in Utah. So you can kind of study that. And like what Scott said, that's going to be part of your homework, to learn a little bit more about the reservations and where they're located. Just a little bit introduction of who I am. I was born and raised on the Navajo Reservation, which is in the part of Arizona. And I've been in education for over 40 years, both as a teacher and as an administrator. So I have a pretty good idea of what school is like, but in the transition from being a classroom teacher to an administrator, principal, there's a little bit more in terms of, if you will, driving the bus instead of being a passenger of the bus. And presently I serve as the American Indian Education Specialist for the Utah State Board of Education. And Renee is my assistant. So, I know that she's out there. You can give a holler if you want, Renee. Now let's go to the second slide. This is an area that oftentimes we have a head-on collision with the American Indian way of culture and the dominant society, which is white. And even the name is a little bit more controversial these days. For the American Indian, and you have the white, long ago, history-wise, we were once referred to as Indian. And as time goes on through the, years, and things begin to change, population changes, the reservations begin to shrink a little bit. We're a little bit more into the area of being controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The name from Indian now has become American Indian. Now, you look into the Constitution, there's only 2 places that you find the word American Indian in there. So, and this was all American Indian land base. Years go on, time changes. Now we're referred to as Native Americans. And that's probably around the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And today, we use that quite a bit interchangeably. Time goes on. Now we're referred to as First Nations, especially up in the north, when you have the north states along the border of Canada, you find that a lot of the American Indian tribes up there, they refer to themselves as First Nations. Time goes on. Now we're referred to as Indigenous. So within those years, within the last 300, 400, 500 years, our names change quite a bit. Now the question that we ask ourselves now, what do we refer to ourselves as? I feel that we can have an interchangeable thought here, an interchangeable conversation. But in my way of expressing, I prefer American Indian, and we can go off on another conversation on why. Now you get to the other is the white. What do we call the white people? Are they Europeans? Are they white? Are they Anglo? Again, there you have that question to answer also. What do we call you guys? Do we call you guys, white? Do we call you guys Anglos? Do we call you Europeans? I really don't know. But in this sense, through this comparison, I'm going to refer to you guys, or the white people, as white. Now, we also have some characteristics of the American Indian, which you find on the left-hand side of the column. And the white race, you have on the right side of the column. Now, not all American Indians exhibit these characteristics anymore. You find that a lot of American Indians now live in the middle of the road. So oftentimes they switch back and forth. I'm going to give you some examples of this because I've experienced this, as well as I've observed this through my association with the school districts, as well as with the community, and as well as people that I come across. We live in an extended family concept, which I just explained a few minutes ago. We live in a clan system, and I belong to a clan, and Dustin belongs to a clan. And I think James and Dominique, they also belong to a clan. So those clans will basically identify who we are, where we come from, and basically some information as to who we are. And you get to the other, to the white, I don't know if you guys have any type of setup like that. And from my research, it's just thinking about oneself or thinking about the individual. I couldn't find any other research other than that points back to themselves. But see, our relationship is very, very deep. And one example of this, for your agency, when you do have a meeting with possibly with children or with students or with families, you ask for a meeting. Within that meeting, sometimes they bring the whole clan. They bring everybody, mom, dad, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles. I've experienced this. And sometimes that you have an aunt or an uncle that would stand before the parents. Instead of the parents being there, you'll have the aunt or uncle representing that student. So again, this is an extended type of concept that we live in. An example of that was, being a principal at a school, and there were oftentimes that, I had to discipline some students, and I'll ask for a mom or a dad to come in. And there's two things that happen. Sometimes I have the whole family clan come in and they want to listen. Or at times that I have an aunt or an uncle that come in and, it's not a parent, it's not the mom or a dad. So I think that's a cultural difference between the two groups. The second is sharing, everything belongs to others is another extended family concept that is shared as opposed to ownership. Let me give you a few examples here. You get down to the reservation, you find that a few of those homes, they do have a fence around their homes. In some homes, they don't. And the reason why they have fences around their homes is, again, it's going to the other extreme in terms of ownership. This belongs to them. This is their domain, and it's either that you guys keep out or I'll keep myself in. So there's a difference between the two. Oftentimes on a reservation, you find that the only fence that you find running along the reservation boundaries is the Bureau of Land Management fences. And very seldom you find that there's a fence around someone's home. Again, that's a concept that they live by, a cultural difference between the two groups. And oftentimes that when we do meet with students, you find that a lot of these students avoid the eye contact. I used to find this quite a bit with my students, as well as being an administrator. And oftentimes I used to see this with adults. And, this is my, through my research and my rationale, is that the reason why they avoid the looking, contact with the eye, to avoid that, is because they have respect for authority. And oftentimes I used to see this with our students. And today, when I walk into a classroom, I go and visit and monitor some of the schools in the area, and I find that some of the American Indian students still hold on to that cultural piece where they avoid to look you in the eye. And it basically is because of the respect that they have for you. And one experience I had down in Shiprock, I was a principal at Tsebata Middle School in Shiprock, New Mexico. We just hired a brand new teacher, and at the beginning of a school, we had those teachers stand out in front of their classrooms by the door, and we see this guy running down the hallway, Johnny. And the teacher says, "Hey, Johnny, come on back here. We have a rule here. And the teacher starts to communication in terms of the rules and how to conduct themselves in a classroom building and how to conduct themselves in the hallway. And Johnny's not looking that teacher in the eye. And the teacher says to Johnny, Johnny, look at me when I'm talking to you. Now we had a head-on collision with culture there, because at home, they're basically the cultural aspect of that characteristic is that they avoid the eye contact. But when they get into school, it's the eye contact. So now Johnny walks away a little confused. So, I think if we have that understanding as to what culture is for certain groups, specifically for American Indians, you find that this cultural aspect, it really resonates among communication with them. Now, we also have the next is that unconcerned with time, as opposed to structured, time-oriented. This is a place where I become time-oriented. It started from my father. My father, my dad was a Navajo code talker. So him being a Marine, he was very structured and time-oriented. What he used to say is that if you're 5 minutes early, you're 5 minutes late. so with that time structure, I'm concerned with time. I'm a little cognizant of that structure. But we find that a lot of these kids, they're unconcerned with time. They're more concerned about what's going on presently. The present time that's happening right now instead of down the road. So it's and again, it's a cultural aspect that they have. And again, they move in the middle of the road. And the last on that slide is being humbled and cooperative versus competitive. We can go off and talk about that also. Let's go to the next page. We question ourselves in terms of cultural identification versus there's no question about cultural identification. And a lot of this falls into appropriation. We see this quite a bit during November because that's an American Indian month. Everybody wants to dress and have that little conversation with pilgrims. And you have these students, especially the primary grades, they cut themselves out little pieces of paper, look like feathers, and they put it in their bonnet. And, it goes on and on and on. And sometimes it goes into the high schools and on the national stage now. The Washington Redskins at one time they were called, but now they're called Washington. And again, that's the appropriation there. There was no question about cultural identification. No one asked the local tribes whether that is kosher or not. So, and that becomes very, very controversial. And we have some instances here in the state of Utah. The next is we honor the elders. It's the elders, it's the old people, the people who have lived years, as opposed to those in the youth. Here I gravitate toward the youth because I raise my children, and I see my grandchildren being raised also. Dancing for religious expression, dance for pleasure. And I saw this at the school where I was at. I was a principal at Chinle High School in Chinle, Arizona, as well as Riverside, California, where I saw American Indians on a Friday night. They had a powwow, congratulating all the seniors. And there's a lot of expression given religiously. And the next night, on Saturday night, they come back for the prom, dressed in a completely different way. And they're dancing for pleasure. So there's a difference between the two groups. The next two little items there is respect other religions. Oftentimes that we find that these kids or students who are incarcerated, they're looking for native counseling. I think as individual, we respect that. I think I had an incident of this sort about 6 years ago when I made the tour down in the southern part of Utah in the San Juan School District. There were a couple students that were incarcerated there, and as I communicated with those two students, and one of the students really emphasized that they like to have counseling in their traditional ways, so that, we respect that, as opposed to being converted to another religion. I used to see this quite a bit on the reservation. And one, this is just a little story here. That one day, this is my second place of my employment as a teacher at Fort Wingate High School in New Mexico. It's a small community, and we had about maybe 600-700 students at the high school. There was 2 elementaries and 1 high school. And it was a compound where we had teacherage. And that one day, my dad came and my mom, and I was driving them around the community, and we went down this one road, and there was 3 churches sitting side by side. And he asked me what are these buildings? I said, well, there are 3 churches here. And he says, stop right here, son. So I pulled over to the side. Then he looks at those 3 buildings. And he says, I've been baptized in all 3 churches. And I was kind of confused. And I said, why were you baptized in all 3 churches? He says, one of those 3 churches should be right. Yeah, I said, yeah, I guess. So one of the 3 has to be right. So, and the last is on that scale is learning through culture versus learning through books. Can you go to the next slide? And one big example of that is, go to the next slide. One big example of that is that oftentimes that we have animals, we have things that crawl and swim, things that are 4-legged, and some of the animals, some of the reptiles, they hold sacred to certain Indian tribes. For the Navajo, the frog is one of the areas where we don't dissect, but oftentimes that our schools say that you got to dissect a frog to receive a grade. But again, I think there's a way around that. This is just one small example. We can go off on this conversation also. Because of time, I want to go to the last slide. The last slide is something that we have with our students, with anybody. I listened to Scott's presentation, which I like, because oftentimes that he has a lot of I feel worthless, I have no purpose, I cannot do it. See, oftentimes that we find our American Indian students in these 4 areas. We find that they accepted the culture that they're in. So today we find that a lot of these students here are coming off the reservation, living in the urban areas. They accept the culture that they're in. They accept the culture that they are residing. Sometimes they reject the culture. And sometimes that where you find that person rejecting is because they're not accepted, or something happened at school, and so on and so forth. The third one is probably the best place to be, is to become bicultural. I learned this early on, becoming bicultural. So I think a lot of these kids, they do that bicultural stuff pretty well. And the last is probably the most controversial and most dangerous, I think, sometimes, because of their livelihood, is that you reject both cultures and they start their own. So it's something that we, as American Indians, we take this the cultural stuff very serious, because again, we like to see our kids adapt to both cultures. I can go back to my children as well as my grandchildren to be a bicultural person. So that's my last slide. And I guess, Dustin, I'll follow your lead in terms of if there's any questions or comments or or
Yeah. Are there, thanks, Chuck. Are there any questions at all? I saw one question that discussed what monies are available for Native students that want to attend college. And I did a quick response there. There are a number of scholarships, private scholarships that are available, but it really depends on what tribe you go to or you're enrolled with. Every tribe has different resources available. Most of them are merit-based. They go off grades and ACT scores, so it results in being a pretty competitive process. Navajo Nation, I think they have like 25,000 scholarships a year, and they have like 75,000 kids applying for it. So it gets really hard. And so my wife's tribe, they didn't offer her tuition money. They did offer her a $400 a month living stipend when she was in college. So that covered her rent. They didn't cover her graduate degree. So we took loans out to get through law school and her master's program, but we'll be paying for that for the rest of our lives. And but you know, it's going to vary. Are there any other questions? Just take your.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would invite everybody to come off mute, or like Myra had done, pop your question in the chat. Let's see.
I have a question. I'm just wondering how much blood in someone do they still remain the Indian? Do you know what I mean? How much bloodline? So that's, I don't, the definition, I don't know how you.
Okay. So usually they term that as blood quantum. For the federal government, that's different. The federal government, for some reason, put a blood quantum on tribes and said you have to be at least 1/4 Indian blood before we recognize you as an individual Indian. For tribes can determine whatever blood quantum they want. Some have a lineage base, if you can just show lineage. Navajo Nation is 1/4. Ute tribe is 5/8, and you have to have two. Both of your parents have to be enrolled. That's a pretty high standard, but they leave it up to the tribes to determine that really, and so it can vary, whatever it needs. Now that's if you want to be legally Indian, right? If you want to be enrolled with your tribal government. Otherwise, blood quantum really doesn't become a factor. It's probably, at least my opinion, it's how you live your life. You know, are you living Indian? It doesn't really matter, because I've had friends that didn't have the blood quantum to meet Navajo Nation enrollment requirements, but they grew up right next to me, right? They went to the same ceremonies I went to. They went to the same high school I went to. They spoke Navajo better than me, but they're not eligible for enrollment, you know. And so are they any less Indian than me? I would say that they aren't. But to be legally, every tribe has their own blood quantum standard.
Just a quick question. I've had some students that we have been trying to get their identification number for them. So that just brings up, so I'm wondering, how does that happen at birth? If the child is born on the reservation, does that happen automatically? Is that something they apply for at birth with paperwork? You know, I'm trying to educate myself a little bit to help make that happen. And we were able to, I had to solicit a lot of help. And we did get that done, but I'd like to know a little bit more about that process and how that happens.
Most tribes have a vital records office or an enrollment office, and your parents usually have to fill out paperwork to enroll your child. If you're Chuck, as an educator, can you just call and see? Is there a process that's set up for that for students?
You know that I think a lot of times that because these are special cases on the reservation where you have a social worker that will do a lot of the legwork for you. You know, they'll provide that application when that person is born. application for enrollment, application for social security number, an application for their birth certificate. All of that is in kind of it is in a one package, but you get off the reservation, you're on your own on that in terms of applying for the certificate of Indian blood as well as applying for your social security card. So there's a difference between the two. So if you're advocating for someone off the reservation, just kind of be aware that that person is an American Indian, specifically with a tribe, possibly Navajo, and you apply to the Navajo tribe, and there are 5 agencies on the reservation, depending on where that mother and father are coming from, and call that agency. And a lot of this is online, but when they ask for documents, it has to be the original, and they'll get that information, they'll send it back to you. Because I've gone through this process with my youngest daughter. She married a white person and a child. So I just got all that information together and I took it down to the reservation. They processed all that. It came back, and I had a certificate of Indian blood for that child. So that's that's a good question, though. A lot of
So
people get caught up in this.
Yeah, so you would have to mail the birth certificate, the original birth certificate, if you didn't have access to go to the reservations, to a recording office or something like that.
Yes, that in your Social Security, because once they're born, oftentimes that Social Security card is you apply for that. So if you attach those 2 documents, the original, you send it to the agency, they'll record that. And they'll send
and then return the document.
And they'll return the document along with the certificate of Indian blood.
Okay, great, thanks.
Some tribes offer an ID, a picture ID, and
Yeah.
some tribes don't. So it might just be a piece of paper. Like most of the time, Navajo Nation just gives you a paper. It says Certificate of Indian Blood.
Yeah.
Some tribes will issue a picture ID with it. I've always felt safer just like I get paranoid just sending off stuff for my passport, right? To send off everything. Well, crap, I hope I get this back. And so even with enrollment, I drive down there and I hand it to them and I sit there. I just make a day of it.
Yeah, it is a little bit scary to send the original.
Mm-hmm.
We were trying to help some students have access to a medicine man for some ceremonies regarding the death of their mother. And they had to have that identification number to access, those ceremonies and kind of the sacredness of what was happening. And just, for some reason, only 50% of this family had those identifications.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we jumped through a lot of hoops. Some of it, I think, was COVID. But I just wondered when COVID wasn't happening, what really the procedure was. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, with COVID, a lot of offices for tribal government shut down, and so they're only taking like mail-in applications. And so I have one that I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for that office to open before I enroll her, because I'll drive down there and do it. That's just me. Personal preference.
Now, what if I showed up being a white person and I was doing that on behalf of a student? Would that be inappropriate? Would it be better to find someone to do it?
Are birth parents available?
No.
Okay, then most of the time, if you have the legal paperwork that authorizes you to do it, or if they have
a foster parent, foster parent.
The foster parent would probably be able to do it as long as they had access to documents and the things that they had. Yeah.
Just to add to that, what I had my daughter do was to write a statement, and it was authorized by the notary.
Mm-hmm.
So that that made it a little bit more official. That I'm not just coming through there, but I was there for a purpose. A written statement, plus it was notarized.
Yeah, if you get something called a power of attorney, and it just has your name, that person, your student's name, and say you're authorized to do X, Y, and Z really specifically, and have the student, or if they're in foster care, they may have a guardian ad litem that's appointed to them. You can have somebody sign on behalf of that, and that power of attorney gives you that authority to do that, and that would be recognized.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. There was a couple that I'm not sure if it got lost in the chat or maybe it came to, but there was a question about Native American versus American Indian. Is there a preference with terminology? Or is it like individual?
I can answer that. Maybe, well, comfortably, I feel much more comfortable saying American Indian, but I have to justify why I say American Indian. For that person, if there's a difference between the two, for me, there's no difference between the two, but you justify why you're calling that person the name. Like, some of the old people on the reservation, they would say Indian, and you get off the reservation, they would say indigenous. And I think it's just preference, but if you express your indigenous term, you justify why. Why do you call them indigenous? Why you call them First Nations or American Indian? In my case, I prefer American Indians.
Yeah, I would read your audience. If you're speaking to a bunch of Navajos, just say Navajo.
Yeah.
But if you're mixed into a mixed group of Native people, just let them know at the beginning. Especially if you're presenting, and I do this, I say this to my classes. I'm going to use American Indian, Indigenous, and Native American interchangeably, just to get you used to hearing all these terms, because depending on who you're speaking with, they may use one of these. But I think in law, most legal documents, Supreme Court decisions, legislation, at least on the federal level, uses American Indian. So when I'm working in the legal aspect of things, I'll say American Indian. Otherwise, I'll say Native American, Indian, American Indian, Indigenous. Indigenous has, last 10 years probably really taken off. And so you can probably get away with that.
Yeah.
But personal preference, I agree.
I really appreciate that. I think sometimes we get so hung up on knowing the right words that we don't even know how to start a conversation sometimes. So knowing that you can kind of read your audience and or even ask, I think will help the mentors.
Or just let them know I'm using these interchangeably.
Right. Yeah, if you're like me, I think that's what applies, because I forget. Like I start on one and then I get in the middle of another one. Chuck knows I worked with the equity department for a while, so I'm privy to some of this, and I've watched the transitions. So that's part of why I was curious about if there was a specific preference at this point. So
I have a legal question. I have students that are have been raised out in the white world, and they're in foster care, and they have no knowledge of their culture as an Indian or anything. And adoption has been stalled because the tribe, the tribe has been brought in. What is the legal and what is the, I guess, methodology behind that?
Okay, so I'm going to preface this with, I'm not your attorney. No.
No, it's I am just curious what the procedure is.
So if there's a federal law that came into place in 1978 called the Indian Child Welfare Act. Prior to 78, they found that a lot of Native children were being adopted out of the tribe. That in conjunction with, women would come in to have babies and were refused medical treatment unless they pre-signed adoption paperwork. Okay.
Oh,
and lately in these last about 8 years, the evidence of non-consensual sterilization of Native women was taking place at the same time as birth was taking place. And so in 78, the the tribes lobbied together and made the argument that Native children are the tribe's most valuable resource. And recognizing that, they passed legislation and a bill that was called the Indian Child Welfare Act, which created a preference in adoption, a tiered preference in adoption for Native children in certain circumstances. So if in a private adoption, there's not a whole lot to do with ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. And you're not subject a lot to their to those regulations. Now I'm going to come back to that, but in a second. But in situations where children are removed from the home, like by government action, whether it be tribal action or state action, if the children are removed from the home and later parental rights are terminated in a government action, then, and you want to move for permanency or permanent placement and adoption, ICWA requires that you notify the tribal government these children are members of, and you offer the tribe a chance to intervene. And so what ICWA says is the tribe does intervene. ICWA says when in preference for adoption, we want the child to go to a family member. Okay, that's preference. And it doesn't, and if there's a mixed couple, right, where you have an Indian parent and a non-Indian parent, that preference goes both ways. It can be the non-Indian or Indian family, but family member first. After that, they'd like the child to go to a member of the tribe. After that, if you can't find one, you go to an Indian family anywhere, or at least there's one Indian parent. And then after that, it goes general adoptions things. I've adopted all four of my children, and two of them were ICWA adoptions, and what we did is I just notified the tribe. I said, hey, I'm working with Navajo Nation and New Mexico foster care, and these children, I'm fostering to adopt these children, and I'd notified Child Family Services, Youth Families Child Services, and I said, would the tribe like to intervene? And all that was a phone call. They called me and said, hey, so you're Navajo? Yeah. How about your wife? I said, well, she's half Navajo, but she's enrolled. She's also Sioux Assiniboine, and she's enrolled Sioux Assiniboine. Okay. And then we sent them the background paperwork saying that their parents were like in prison, or but their parental rights are terminated, and the tribe was like, okay, we're good with this. They had a Navajo parenting class we had to take, and we did that. The problem happens is when you don't. And now I'm going to go back to the private adoptions. Okay, so private adoptions, ICWA doesn't normally kick in, but if a lot of times these adoptions that cause problems are two high school kids meet up at Disneyland one summer. One's from Oregon and one's from New Mexico. They met at Disneyland. They messed around. They go home. Girl finds out she's pregnant. Okay, doesn't know a lot about the dad, but he's Indian, right? But she doesn't know. So the parents say, hey, you're too young to have a kid. Let's place the child for adoption. They send her off to grandma's. She has the baby. They come back, and then later she happens to go back to Disneyland and runs into the same kid and says, hey, how's it been? How you been? They talk and say, oh, and I think I should tell you something. I got pregnant last time we were together. And he's like, really? Where's the child? Oh, it's adopted. And the kid's like, oh, crap. Man, I'm sorry. And then goes home and tells his parents. And then the parents say, I have a grandchild out there, and where's my grandchild? And that's when all this starts. The reality, the cool thing to do, the proper thing to do is if there's an adoption taking place, you notify the tribe. Most of the time, the tribe just wants to make sure that the kid, if the kid is eligible for enrollment with the tribe, they want him enrolled. They want to make sure that the adoptive family will not withhold cultural teachings from the child. They want to make sure that there's an open adoption. And I used to be against open adoptions, but I'm not anymore. You know, I have open adoptions with all my kids. I'm trying to find parents for 2 of my kids because at some point, my kids are going to ask me questions. Why did this happen? Why was I placed for adoption? And I'm not going to know. But hopefully they have a good enough relationship with their birth parents that they can talk about that later. You know, and I'm all up for that. I think that's the healthiest thing to do. Now there's some, if it turns out where this person is just a horrible person and would just make my kid's life horrible, we'll make that's a judgment call. We probably won't let them, you know, but at least this is who they are. You can talk to them later but know that they're having troubles right now. But if you want to learn more about that, that's the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. You can get really good summaries online, but when it applies and when it doesn't. But that's the reasoning behind that law. I went off too far, but I'm sorry. But anyway, I hope that works. I hope that answered your question.
Well, I think so. I appreciate sometimes I have to go off on the tangent to get the information. So it sounds like a bit of an echo now. Sorry about that.
No, and every case is different with ICWA, and it, you know, and you have to trust the system sometimes. Okay, because I have former students that are now working in social services that work in this case, and they're like, man, I know ICWA's the law, but I don't want to follow it right now. You know, and I'm like, well, you have to trust that the court's going to do the right thing. It's not right on, you know. It's not like, oh, this person's going to be adopted by a bad family just because they're Indian. No, that adoptive family still has to pass certain requirements, still has to meet a level of scrutiny, and every court will look at the best interest of the child. Every judge will, to make sure that happens. And you have to put your faith in the system sometimes, and you have to hope and that each side is doing their best and both working towards the best interest of that child, and trust in that. And that's hard to do, especially when you work with kids, as you bond with them, even as teachers. But it's important.
Well, thank you, Dustin and Chuck. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. And we've spilled over time a little bit. So I think in the interest of time, if you guys have additional questions, you're welcome to email me and I'll forward them on to Dustin and Chuck, or we've got their contact information I can share out if that's what works best. But thank you so much for the presentations today. Haven't heard from Dustin before, so that was nice. And I'm always happy to hear from Chuck, and I always learn something new. So I appreciate that. I hope the mentors did as well. I'll have the recording edited and posted hopefully within the week so that you guys can share this out with some of the other staff who weren't able to participate today. This was a great session. I'm gonna have to rewatch it to pick up all the pieces and make sure I got the information. So thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Let me pop up the post-training survey slide. Let's see. Oh, and thank you so much, Dustin. We appreciate you guys joining us. Okay, let's see. I gotta unshare and reshare. 1 second. There it is. Okay, so now you see the post-training survey slide, and as usual, I'll go ahead and send this out in a follow-up email to everybody. That way, folks who didn't participate today can get in and take that as well. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon.